unacceptably high levels of stunting and micronutrient deficiency. As countries increase their agricultural productivity, which is very strongly correlated with income, you see that the stunting rates in particular come down pretty quickly. And we see similar sorts of things for other measures that are strongly correlated with macronutrient deficiencies. But micronutrient deficiencies are very stubborn. You notice that there's really no change. And obesity begins to enter the picture at relatively modest levels of income and productivity. So we get what's sometimes known as the triple burden of malnutrition. Undernutrition, insufficient calorie and protein intake, micronutrient deficiencies, and overweight and obesity all in the same place at the same time as you enter into lower middle income and middle and upper middle income communities. We take care of the big macronutrient deficiencies, and we suddenly have macronutrient surpluses manifesting in obesity. But the micronutrient part of this, it's only once you get to pretty high income populations that we begin to have pretty small subpopulations that the prevalence of micronutrient deficiency falls satisfactorily. This is one of the areas we're still not paying enough attention to in the food security community. We really need to be focusing much more on micronutrients. This is just a different way of showing the same thing. These are plots of country income against prevalence indicators for everything from anemia and to vitamin A deficiencies. And you can see that the wasting measures, which are the most specific to adequate calorie availability for children, what's the weight per height, wasting measures fall very precipitously at a relatively low income and then have a very flat trajectory thereafter as incomes continue to expand, while you have much slower progress in things like iodine deficiency or anemia. These are just much less responsive to income growth. So we can't just count on poverty reduction to take care of micronutrient deficiency problems. We have to have other interventions as well. The consequences of not dealing with this can be pretty severe. I've already mentioned socio-political unrest. I have a book out last year on this, on food security and socio-political stability. But environmental degradation is a very real concern. Arsenic poisoning of wells in Bangladesh and eastern India are a very direct response to overcultivation of areas that are starting to deplete groundwater and begin to draw in arsenic from soil into wells. And so we're starting to poison people with the water they rely on, largely because of poor management of the water resources in agriculture, because there's over-harvesting, over-cultivation of those particular rice basins. We're starting to see real slowing of poverty reduction and of various food security indicators as a result of higher food prices. This is a graphic that shows you, for example, the World Food Summit targets of declines in the percentage of population undernourished back in 1990, where we were at basically 1 billion people in that status. And the target was to cut it by half by 2015. Many of you have heard of these Millennium Development Goals that come home to roost next year. Well, we're horribly far off target, and we've drifted off target starting when food prices begin to climb back. You notice we've just stalled out here in the 850 to 900 million range, which is the level that we hit in right around the turn of the millennium as food prices hit their all-time low. As food prices have continued to climb, poor people simply can't keep making progress as food prices continue to climb. Their incomes grow, but the cost of a decent diet grows too, and we just don't see progress. So we've been drifting off course. You see similar sorts of things when you look at prevalence numbers. They're not quite as bad because part of this reflects population growth. So this is over a growing base. But every mouth that doesn't get enough food, every child who winds up growing up without fully realizing his or her cognitive and physical potential is a real person, not a percentage of a population. So I would argue this is the number we care about, and let's forget about prevalence rates. They're useful, but they're not the big thing. Now, all of that said, which this may surprise you, I'm actually optimistic about our capacity to address this challenge. And there are several reasons. One is we are starting to see the complacency dissipate. We are seeing serious commitments by governments, by philanthropies to addressing these problems. The Gates Foundation, Buffett, et cetera. The philanthropic side has been stepping up in a very big way over the last decade and is poised to do even more. Governments are beginning to push on this. The Obama administration created something called Feed the Future, which hasn't lived up to its promise, but it is a very real step forward. And it has significantly increased the US government's investments in agricultural and direct nutritional interventions in the developing world. It's not just about agriculture, it's equally about consumer level maternal child health, especially around adequate nutrient intake and social protection programs. One of the things that we've discovered over time is when you invest in nutritional programs, you know, we're the home of finance here in New York City. I run a business school. I care about finance. I think it actually matters to improving living conditions for poor people. The rate of return on investment in nutritional programs is off the charts. Go find a hedge fund manager and tell them you'll give them 16-to-1 returns. They'll put money in it tomorrow. It's surprising to me that we don't put more money in demonstrably high return investments. This is not just a made-up number. This is a very hard cost-benefit calculation done by some really cutting-edge economists on what's the rate of return on nutritional programs in the world. They're doing this for something called the Copenhagen Consensus, trying to identify what are the highest return investments in the world today. And nutritional interventions come out near the top of the list every year right now. So there's hard work behind this. Go look up John Hodnott. He's the source of this 16-to-1 CPA. So higher prices not only are inducing philanthropic and government response investment, they're inducing private investment. The real progress we're seeing in improved cultivars for staples, drought-resistant maize, et cetera, is coming largely from the private sector today. They see money in this, simply put. When food prices are high, there are profits to be made. And one of the good things about profits, people who chase profits increase supply and they tend to invest in technological innovations. We have to make sure that we guard against bad behavior by firms, to be sure. But there's huge progress being made here. And it's not just in agriculture. Information and communication technologies. I would argue probably the single most important technological change in Africa of the last 15 years is the cell phone. I do a lot of work in very remote areas of northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. In northern Kenya, it's about 250 miles to the nearest paved road from where I work. And I used to be there with goat herders and camel herders, and they would talk about having to go through these elaborate networks to find out what the prices are in Nairobi or Addis Ababa for their livestock if they wanted to sell one. Now they reach into their robe and they pull out their cell phone and they call to find out what's the price in the market today. It's enabling them to manage things radically different than they used to. And we see there's a very nice study done in India, what happens to Indian fishermen in Kerala. Once cell phones came in, they were able to increase their revenues 30% because they could call to find out which of the ports along the coast was generating the highest price today for the particular species I just landed. Rather than just going to the port I disembarked from and hoping somebody was there ready to buy halibut from me or whatever you caught, go to wherever someone was looking to buy this and would give you a good return. Fabulous improvement in returns to these fishermen just from a cell phone. It's huge. No government investment in this, by the way. Indeed, it emerged because governments failed to invest in landlines. Africa, you don't find landlines that work in most of the rural places I work, but almost everybody's got a cell phone. The past successes we saw in the last half of the 20th century are huge. They can be achieved again. We just grew complacent for a while. And as people are waking up, as businesses are seeing profit opportunities, as philanthropists and government leaders are recognizing the need to invest, and some of the most forward-looking ones are in the developing world. Again, Brazil, China, India have arguably the best agricultural research infrastructure in the world today because their leadership invested in this. They did not take their foot off the accelerator the way we did in Europe and Canada and the United States for the last 20 years. But as the problems we began to see in the early years of this millennium are becoming appreciated by a larger population of leaders in business, government, and philanthropies, we're seeing a slow return to what I think will be like the latter part of the 20th century. We really will see a big change. Structural demand and supply patterns pose major challenges. If we don't address this, your generation is going to have some serious problems to deal with around the world. I'll be old and feeble, and Brendan will be dabbing drool off the corner of my mouth at that point. But you're going to have real issues to deal with when you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s. And there are food riots in lots of countries, and groundwater aquifers are being fully depleted and causing serious problems, and climate change is only accelerating as we take down more forest to try to plant more land in maize and rice. The problems today are a little more complicated than they were 50 years ago, because climate change, more complicated intellectual property regimes, these things, and just the fact we're starting to butt up against natural limits of land and water availability, these make the challenges a little harder than they were 50 years ago. But the tools available to the science community are also better than they were 50 years ago. We're up to the challenge. We just have to set about getting on with it. The key challenge, I think, in this country is we've got to stop listening to the idiotic statement, America will feed the world. American farmers are the world's most productive. We should take great pride in that. They never have, and they never will, feed Africa and Asia. Africans and Asians will feed Africa and Asia. And if we recognize that that's where the looming challenges are faced, and we recognize that we're all in this together, and if we don't deal with the food challenges looming in Africa and Asia, those problems spill over into the United States, we have to set about addressing the problems where they will exist. The challenges are distinctively African and Asian, with big spillover effects for the rest of the world. And they're not just in the staple grains. It's not just rice, maize, and wheat. It's increasingly fruits and vegetables. If we don't meet the challenge, things could be ugly, but the opportunities are great. There are people making fabulous amounts of money off these innovations right now. Farmland values in the world are at their highest today. Who's the single largest investor in farmland in the world today? Anyone know? How many of you have a TIAA-CREF pension? You are the biggest farmland investor in the world today. So TIAA-CREF, the main pension plan for faculty throughout North America, is the single largest investor in farmland in the world today. Private investor, I should say. Leave out the Chinese government, okay? Single largest private investor in farmland in the world today. And if you have a TIAA-CREF pension, it's done pretty well over recent years because it's making money. Investments in agriculture pay off. People can benefit by putting their money into this, not just the way you and I are, that our pensions look better. Those pensions are doing well because those firms do well. They're enjoying productivity growth. They're out there providing new resources. Even Walmart, as much as I might dislike Walmart, one of my best graduate students did a really watertight analysis of what effect did Walmart's entry into Nicaragua have on smallholder farmers. And the evidence is incontrovertible. It really improved standards of living for the smallholder farmers involved in the Walmart supply chain, for the simple reason that Walmart could squeeze out a lot of the inefficiencies that were confronting smallholder farmers, because they don't have liquidity constraints. They don't have problems affording trucks. They can solve a whole lot of the problems, and they brought new technologies in that helped, especially with fruits and vegetables production in Nicaragua. We can see real progress. People are stepping up to do this. We just have to set about doing it equitably and profitably and sustainably. The biggest challenges, I think, are really going to be around water management, because there's only so much of it to go around, and we're already burning up an awful lot of it in agriculture. So I thank you for your time and your interest and attention, and I'm very happy to field questions or comments. Tell me I'm an idiot and why. All right. Thanks.
Sure. My name is Evan O'Day. I'm a second-year medicine, one of Brendan's classmates. When you were discussing the limitations of supply, you mentioned that most of the world's fish populations are being fished at or beyond sustainable capacity. But does ocean vegetation have the potential to make any significant contribution to supply?
It's a really interesting question, and there are markedly different opinions on this. There's a working group I'm a part of that's based out of Harvard, and we had a kind of working group meeting in September. One of the people there argues that there's a vast capacity to expand harvesting of sea cucumber, all sorts of different things, if we just manage especially coastal reef resources better. Another guy in the room who is a very distinguished marine biologist said that that's nonsense. He just doesn't, he doesn't see where this is going to come from. I don't have the capacity to kind of weigh which of them is most likely right. I would observe, however, that it's really expensive to harvest plant matter from the ocean. Keep in mind that, think of how expensive seaweed is if you go into the groceries here. And this is seaweed that's largely grown right on shore or terrestrially. A lot of it's actually aquaculture. Once you start going to open ocean harvesting of plant material, or even if you just pond it off in coastal areas, it starts to get expensive really quickly. So it's likely that we're still going to do better with terrestrial-based production of plant matter. The ocean is probably a good place for protein, but not so much for vitamins and minerals. Or for non-fish-based minerals, I should say. Yeah, please.
You mentioned earlier that there was a sort of a 16-to-1 return on investment in supplemental nutrition programs. Where do you see that payoff? Is that a real sort of financial payoff to investors, or is that like an economic productivity payoff?
Yeah, so this is a social return, meaning that if we take, for example, the increased capacity of people to work because they no longer are homesick when they're suffering from vitamin and mineral deficiencies, we take the increased productivity that comes from kids who stay in school longer, become more educated, therefore become more productive in life and work longer, et cetera. When you compound the various mechanisms through which nutritional programs, especially early childhood nutritional programs, is specifically what Hodnot et al. Were studying, early childhood nutrition programs. So you see this manifest in adult wages, adult earnings. A famous experiment run in Guatemala where kids were given protein-enhanced drink, and then there was a control group, and they went back and visited these kids once they were adults, and you saw the educational attainment differences, the earnings differences of the kids who had been experimentally given these micronutrient-enhanced and protein-enriched drinks versus those who got the same, otherwise identical conditions except for that treatment. You saw these huge effects. So it comes through these different pathways, but the overall earnings, the overall generation in the economy of productivity of output is what they're capturing in those measures. So it's not the return to Procter & Gamble went up by that. Sorry, I used the hedge fund analogy just as a way of thinking about, we should, especially political leaders, should be thinking about what's the return to society from a dollar invested.
So I mean, that makes sense for public, or for government or philanthropic investment, but what incentives are there for more private sector investments?
Oh, there's real money to be made. I mean, think of information communication technologies, mobile phones people. They're not in it to try to do good things, but they happen to be doing very good things as they're making a ton of money. Monsanto's doing quite well, thank you, financially. We have more acres in genetically modified crops in the developing world today than we have in the high-income countries. We've never seen a technology diffuse, an agricultural technology, diffuse as quickly as the relatively small band of glyphosate-ready and BT-resistant crops have that Monsanto and other life sciences firms developed. They're making tons of money off of this. Small farmers around the world love it because their cotton crops don't get eaten by weevils. And so they can actually sell their crop and make money. Most of this, by the way, is still not, in the developing world, most of it is not food crops. Most of it's cotton, it's fiber. But much of that is because of government restrictions against GM foods in developing countries.
Since you brought up the M word, Monsanto and others, are food monopolies true? Is it a few companies that control large swaths of production, or is that just alarmist, leftist?
Monopolies arise from intellectual property. I mean, that's literally what a patent is, right? A patent is an arrangement whereby society grants monopoly power to the holder of the patent in exchange for the public release of the information behind the innovation, right? That's the deal. The idea behind patenting is that we think it will accelerate discovery and innovation if people have to release their innovations publicly rather than hold them as trade secrets. By the way, most industries, most innovation is still held as trade secrets. it's not patented. Life sciences firms and chemicals and pharmaceuticals, they're the big ones that patent. And that creates monopoly power. So Monsanto is absolutely a monopolist around the seeds that it still has under patent. And it generates big profits from that. One of the things I should say, that you can do as a monopolist, though, is you can also price discriminate, we call it in economics. You can charge different prices to different people if nobody else is out there to be able to undercut your price when you charge a high price. Seed is one of those things they can price discriminate on, just like drugs. So HIV/AIDS treatments, the prices are radically different. You wonder why there are laws banning the importation of pharmaceuticals? It's to protect patents and to allow patent holders to price discriminate. So they can charge much lower prices in low-income countries than they can in the United States, because in low-income countries, they wouldn't have a market if they charged the US rate. They'll still make money just selling the product at marginal cost or a little above it, in Cameroon and Nigeria. But they certainly don't want those prices coming back to the US, so you ban importation, cross-border flow of patented product, pharmaceutical in particular. It's the same thing with seed. So seed prices vary markedly across countries. So patented BT cotton seed in South Africa and in India are a fraction of the price they are in Arkansas. And the Arkansas farmers aren't happy about that. That's one reason why you commonly hear them complain about this. So is there a monopoly? There's absolutely a monopoly. Every place there's IP. Is it good or bad? I tend to think it's bad, personally. I think our patent systems are way too strict and confer monopoly power way too quickly. But once product is out of patent, these are extremely competitive markets. I mean, the seed sector in Africa is crazy competitive. In Kenya alone, there are at least 15 different maize seed producers and distributors. Nobody's got market power there. They're all battling for market share, but everybody competes on price and product quality, just like most products you see here in the US. Yeah, in the back, please.
I was wondering, my understanding is that the agricultural industry in America is highly subsidized by the government, and that has global effects. So can you kind of touch on that and how that policy, I guess, might affect the future of food security and how changes in that, or likely changes, might also affect it?
You're absolutely right. There's huge subsidization, not just here. Here, Europe, and Japan, Canada to a lesser degree. Cumulatively, the EU, Japan, and the United States subsidize to the tune of about $1.25 billion a day to the agriculture sector. It's massive. Single largest industry subsidization in the world today is in agriculture, in the high-income countries. The puzzle is it's the opposite in most of the developing world, where there are implicit taxes on agriculture due to price controls, due to a variety of different things that ultimately take money out of farmers' pockets in poor countries, where here we pour money into farmers' pockets. Part of that is the mythology of the poor farmer, which was true back in the Dust Bowl era. It's not a complete coincidence that you find Farm Bureau and others distribute John Steinbeck a lot in Washington, because it helps to cultivate the mythology of farmers in the United States are poor, they're struggling. Today, actually, the median income of a farm household in the United States is higher than that of non-farm households in the United States. Not by much, but there's no longer this gap that existed a couple of generations ago. Those programs arose in response to the very real gaps that existed between farm families and non-farm families a couple of generations ago. But like so many government programs, once they're in place, they're really hard to pull back. They've changed over time. At this point, pulling them out would have multiple effects, some good, some bad. The bad effect would be that think of what happens when you're subsidizing farmers, especially subsidizing farmers to produce. It's one thing to subsidize them to pull land out of cultivation, which we do for environmental protection purposes largely. When they pull land out of cultivation, it reduces supply and drives up prices. Most farm subsidies are about production. And so by implicitly encouraging production, we increase supply and drive down prices and make food more affordable for poor people. So the big danger we run in farm program reforms in the US and Europe and Japan is that we could inadvertently actually hurt poor people around the world who are food consumers. There are important groups for whom that's not true. Sugar producers, cotton producers. You know, if you're a cotton grower in Mali, you are purely hurt by U.S. cotton policy because it drives down cotton prices. And if you are a farm worker picking cotton in Mali, you're hurt by it because you get lower wages. Indeed, some people argue, and there's some reasonable economic theory behind this, not good empirical evidence, but some people argue that the apparent growth in slavery in West Africa is due in part to unsustainably low prices for things like cocoa and cotton that farmers in places like Mali and Cote d'Ivoire simply can't afford to pay their workers. They enslave them just to be able to make a go of it, in part because of cotton policy in the U.S. Now that's a kind of inflated claim, but it's the mechanism at work that causes harm in some places, while at the same time rice policy in the United States and groundnut policy, peanut policy, helps lots of poor people who are consumers. So it's a mixed bag. Sorry?
That policy helps.
By driving down prices. And as far as we wind up encouraging increased production on the global market, this helps to pull prices down. It makes diets more affordable. Inadvertently, this isn't at all what the Georgia delegation is after in Congress. They're trying to help Georgia peanut growers. But it helps poor peanut consumers in Senegal and in Gambia because it does help keep prices lower so their families can afford a better diet. So it's a mixed bag. It's ridiculously expensive. Agricultural policy in the US and Europe and Japan is enormously wasteful, but it's not quite as simple as some people would make it out to be, that it's going to be a pure bad thing or a pure good thing if and when we finally end it. We've got to be very careful in how we transition out of these crazy farm programs.
Okay. What is the,
Unfortunately, we're out of time. If you want to finish your question.
oh, it's just, what do you think the trends are going to be for those programs? Like, is there more of a push to change them or to not? Or
They change. The question is whether they change for the better. A lot of the programs in this last farm bill, the farm bill enacted last year, the U.S. farm programs moved increasingly to subsidized insurance programs for crop producers, which are just ridiculously wasteful and basically a big payoff to the insurance industry, because we are very heavily subsidizing insurance programs right now, and it's not clear. And I say this as somebody who designs insurance products for African farmers, so I don't have a thing against insurance, but we've just made a massive move in that direction in the United States. It's very hard to defend on any reasonable economic grounds.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming, guys.
Thank you.